Hey, what's going on, you guys? My name is the Raptor, and you've all given me more versus matchups, so it's time for more versus matchup review. You know the drill by this point. Read the video description to find out how to contribute to this stuff, and if you like listening to this sort of stuff, consider subscribing to see more like it from me. These are all just my personal basic thoughts, so you can share any of yours down in the comments, but enough chit-chat. Let's get to work. First up on the list, Sportacus versus Pepsiman, LazyTown versus PepsiCo. There was a time where it felt like Sportacus was just blowing up in this community, and everyone was talking about so many different potential matchups for him. Like, I was hearing Homelander or A-Train from the boys, Yujiro from Baki, even Queso a little bit I think I was hearing, and some others here and there. However, at least as far as the vocal crowd goes, this one seems to be what most people have gravitated towards. And honestly, I think I get it. I think I understand why this is the one that people like. It is very, very weird at first glance, like this random kids show character versus this random food or drink mascot, but it actually does work decently well as a contrast matchup, or it fits into my description of what makes a good quote-unquote contrast matchup. That's just me though. And the debate feels like physical stats, like overall physical superiority, versus a very specific weakness exploitation, which is not the craziest debate dynamic out there, but at least it's still a little more unique than your standard issue death battle stomp. And yes, these are very strange characters to analyze, but if you think that's a problem, you have not been watching enough of this show. Death Battle has been handling stuff like this for a while, and they usually do it really, really well. Whether you're looking at Saitama versus Popeye or any of their True Blue cartoon episodes, there's just great calculation potential here and can really let the humor speak for itself. That's when I think Death Battle humor is at its best instead of trying to force random jokes, and this matchup has that written all over it. I'd be really excited to see what they do with that. However, this is actually one of the few matchups in this series where I'm pretty confident in saying that this one probably won't happen. It's not like a 0% chance or anything like that, but the crew has definitely latched onto something else, that being Sportacus versus Yujiro, and usually when they do that, like I think of Light versus Columbo, Hulk versus Godzilla, etc., that usually just ends up being what they do, whether or not that's what most people really want. And I could see this working in a very similar way. I could be wrong, but that's just kind of how I see it right now. Next up, Daffy Duck versus Donald Duck, Warner Brothers versus Disney. I have not given this matchup enough spotlight on the channel yet, because if I ever want to talk about either of these series, it's usually just Mickey versus Bugs, and that's my bad. I'm gonna try to rectify that now. I know some people who actually like this one more than Mickey versus Bugs, and I'm not gonna lie, I cannot blame them at all. This is one of the most obvious classic cartoon ideas like conceivable, but that does not mean that it is bad. Quite the opposite, in fact. I find it to be very, very pure in its appeals. If Wile versus Tom is the epitome of cartoon tomfoolery, and Mickey versus Bugs is the epitome of cartoon legacy, then this one is the epitome of cartoon violence and the humor that ensues from it. So naturally, it fits great into the Death Battle format on both of those levels. And this is one of those matchups where it's just the crazier the better. And yes, I know that is a double-edged sword, because you could always say, well, what if they bite off more than they can chew? But honestly, with some very rare exceptions, Death Battle doesn't tend to have that problem anymore, so I honestly just think the crazier that you go, the better you represent these characters. I mean, that's kind of what they're all about. Now, unfortunately, I could see some people suffering from Toon Force fatigue for this show, especially if more of those matchups end in a draw. At the time of me recording this, Wile versus Tom has not come out yet, so we don't know how that one is going to end. Personally, I feel like it shouldn't always have to end that way, but if it does in fact need to, then I don't want Death Battle to misrepresent the fight dynamic, so it's really hard, but the point is we just don't know yet. But staying on the optimistic side and saying that this one does not have to end in a draw, or assuming it doesn't have to end that way, then I do very much think it is worthwhile. The tone is amazing, there is so much fun you could have with it, you can basically do anything you want with it in the fight itself. The banter potential, oh my god, like, it's just so pure. That's the best word I can use to describe it. It's just so pure in what it has. Now, in terms of its likelihood, I don't think they would want to do this one so close to Mickey versus Bugs, and I kind of still want to assume that that one would probably come out before this one. I think doing both of them at some point throughout their run is worth it. I do think it is worthwhile. I'm just not sure if this one is going to happen all that soon. You know, just trying to manage expectations. I still really want to see this one though. Moving on, Scratch and Grounder versus Buzz and Elite, Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog versus Cyberchase. I'm gonna be totally honest, this is an idea that I barely heard of before it popped up on my community tab. I think I'd seen it like a couple places before, but not much more than that. And I'm definitely not too familiar with either of these series as well, but I don't think it takes a genius to really get the gist of this one. This matchup is not deep, the characters themselves are not deep, but these duos are basically each other, at least as far as their roles in their stories and their competence levels. And honestly, that is pretty funny. I'm not going to deny that. That is a pretty funny concept in and of itself. And yeah, this is an episode where humor and tone are very important. Like I said earlier, Death Battle has kind of been inconsistent with their humor in the past. In some episodes, their jokes just land better than others, but they have also just made funnier episodes, like episodes where the point is to be funny, and they tend to do those pretty decently actually, so I just see this being another one of those. And you do definitely have more options with 4 combatants, in basically every regard, but especially in regards to the humor. So generally speaking, I find this idea to be perfectly fine as a sillier matchup. It's not going to blow you away with anything unironically, but it's still a pretty entertaining idea. There are some matchups that I do think do a better job of balancing funny stuff with unironically awesome stuff, like hell, I think back to Sportacus versus Pepsiman for an example like that. And there are some 2v2 fights that I like way more than this one, but this one has a completely different purpose, and I think if that is nailed, if that purpose is nailed, it could still be a good time. Like, I think back to Hercule Satan versus Dan Hibiki. Just imagine if we got an episode like that today. I think that could be a really fun time. Now, generally, this is a matchup that I do not think is likely, but it is still fun to talk about, and I know there are some people that like talking about matchups even if they're not very likely to happen on Death Battle. And I think that is also perfectly fine as long as you can tell the difference between those two ideas, you know? Like, some of our favorite matchups aren't likely to happen just because we want it so bad. We're not going to be able to manifest it into existence just because we want it so bad. Like, it does need to gain a large following, and maybe this matchup will at some point, but we'll just have to wait and see. After that, Cobra Commander versus Red Skull, G.I. Joe versus Marvel. I'm going to specifically look at this battle through the lens of an army fight, that being all of Cobra versus all of Hydra in this case. It just seems to be how most people look at it. And yeah, this seems to be one of the most popular army fights right now, or at least it's gained some more popularity as of late, and I honestly think it is very well deserved. It uses famous criminal organizations that you love to root against, which is always so much fun, and it's basically a perfect combination for concept and theme, so much so that to me at least, it almost feels like a necessity for a show like Death Battle. And after Bowser vs. Eggman, which was such a balancing act in both the animation and the analyses, I know Death Battle can pull something like this off. There's a lot of cool things to go over, such as the histories, the characters involved, and their capability heights with their tech, and I actually think it creates a pretty interesting and unpredictable debate. That partially stems from the fact that we can't really look at previous Death Battles to know how they would judge this one, but still, there is so much going on here that I do find the debate to be pretty interesting. Now, believe it or not, there is definitely some touchy subject matter that would pop up with this matchup, and I do think Death Battle would need to be careful with the writing or the tone of the analyses at various points. I don't think the subject matter would necessarily stop Death Battle from making the episode altogether, unless they were worried about money or, you know, YouTube pushing it out or whatnot, but even still, I think if they were really passionate about this episode, they would find a way to do it right. I trust them to handle it in the best way possible for a Death Battle. But now I'm gonna say something that I know a lot of people do not want to hear, but I think is 100% true. The amount of battle royales, team battles, and army battles that Death Battle has made are not proportional to how much they are suggested. I see that stuff suggested all the time. For some people, it seems like that's all they want to talk about, but the amount of those episodes that Death Battle has actually done doesn't even cover like 10% of the show. So I'm not really inclined to believe that this episode is particularly likely right now. I don't think they would do this as a 1v1. I think if anything, they would do it as an army battle, but I just see no reason to believe that it's inevitable or that it will happen particularly soon. I feel like I'm being so negative as far as talking about the likelihood of the matchups in this episode, but that's just the way I feel about it right now. Up next, Donkey Kong versus Crash Bandicoot, Nintendo versus Activision. I'll admit this one seemed a little weird to me at first when I first heard about it, I want to say like 2 years ago or something, but since then it has started to take off a little bit more, and I believe it was one of the Kickstarter pitches, so, that's definitely going to do something for it. And since looking into it a little bit more, I can say that this matchup leverages well-known aspects of these characters decently well, to the point that I do think I kind of like it now. It has very similar humor potential to Donkey Kong vs. Knuckles, or at least the quality of the humor, and I like that the fight dynamic has a nice mix of brawling and simple tech. Like, I think that's a pretty cool aspect that both of these characters share. And these characters have both been on Death Battle before, but they are really good characters to get expanded analyses, because we haven't seen either of them in a long time, especially DK. And overall, this one has a really fun vibe. Even if I didn't like anything about this idea, I don't think I'd be able to argue against that whatsoever. The one thing that I still find kind of iffy about this idea, though, is the debatability, and this kind of leads into a larger conversation about how important debatability actually is to a matchup. I think we can all agree that debatable fights are preferable for something like Death Battle, but I also recognize that not every single character is going to have fitting matchups that are debatable. That's just the way it goes sometimes. However, I do think there is such a thing as a more interesting stomp, at least relatively speaking, depending on the specific reasoning, and I do think there are some matchups that are easy to tell who would win, regardless of if you're in the versus community or not, but some that are only easy to tell because you're in the versus community and because you know all about power scaling and stuff like that, the latter of which I am usually a lot more forgiving towards. And with this matchup, it's a little hard to tell, although I'm leaning more on the side of you can tell who would win even if you're not in the versus community, so that is something that I feel I should knock against it, although I will admit that it could be a lot worse. And to be honest, I could see this one actually happening on the show. I know there are a couple of crew members that do quite like it, although I also know that these combatants are not the be-all end-all opponent for each other. I do think one or both of these guys will come back at some point down the line, and yeah, I could see it taking this form, potentially. Moving on, Kylo Ren versus Edelgard, Star Wars versus Fire Emblem. This is one of those pretty controversial Star Wars matchups. I've definitely seen a lot of people be outspoken against it, although from what I can tell, it is one of the more major Fire Emblem ones being talked about, so I could understand some people wanting to go out of their way to support it. Personally, I think it's an okay matchup if you really want to use one of these guys on the show, and I mean, if you do, then I can't really blame you for that, but I do think it is one of those ideas that is better in its production or fight potential than it is in most other areas, and I know for some people that is enough for them, but I try to judge matchups in as many different ways as possible, so I feel the need to bring it up. But still, there are distinct stories on both sides for Death Battle to cover. The characters definitely have flashy abilities, and there's a lot of room for cool dueling choreography, which I think they could do really well. And even though I find the matchup itself to be kind of whatever, I would be kind of interested in the voice actor portrayals in the animation and the character writing in the animation and the analyses, because these characters on their own, at least in my opinion, are pretty interesting in their own ways, so I'd like to see how Death Battle handles all of that. I'm pretty sure Death Battle wouldn't use Star Wars Legends for any matchups with sequel characters in them, although funnily enough, not 100% sure, and the only reason why I say that is because Death Battle's justification for using Legends is that it's a simple alternate continuity, like not like an Archie Sonic situation, but like essentially a branching timeline that is supposed to expand on what Jedi and Sith are capable of, and they were applying that level of power to the canon versions of the characters even after Legends was deemed the non-canon timeline. So none of that makes me think that that kind of scaling couldn't be attributed to the sequel characters, but then again, they were the start of a new canon, so I could see Death Battle wanting to prioritize that a lot, kind of like how they prioritized canon a little more than they usually do in Darth Vader versus Obito, and above all else, if you use Legends for this matchup, I don't really think there's much of a debate to be had, so for that reason alone, yeah, I could definitely see them leaving it out. And I think this would be Kylo Ren's episode if he were to ever get one. We know Death Battle really likes using Star Wars as well, so I could see this as an eventuality if they really want to go to the sequels, and I could see them wanting to use Fire Emblem a little more too, don't get me wrong, it's just Star Wars they like to use a lot. I could see them maybe prioritizing other characters from both of these franchises, but at the same time, this one got a Death Battle cast episode, they definitely know this one exists, so yeah, I could definitely see it happening at some point. After that, Lord Boros versus Battle Beast, One Punch Man versus Invincible. I've talked about this one quite a few times over the last few months, so I'll try to keep this section a little shorter, but yes, you guys know that I absolutely love this idea, it's really high up there for me. Yes, I know it has very simple appeals, but it feels like a fight to the death in the most literal sense possible. The appeals overlap with what is like a true, brutal, hot-blooded death battle, and man, I still miss that stuff. So if I can find a fight that emulates that stuff perfectly and works really well for the characters, then of course I'm going to like it. I expect such an intense and over-the-top bloody fight with great banter sprinkled throughout here and there. I do think it could run the risk of style over substance without good choreography mixed in, but I do think it could definitely have both of those elements if done properly. And if done properly, I think this could be one of the most raw animations that we have ever seen on the channel, period. There are some matchups that exist that I kind of feel like have less of a chance of happening on the series realistically because the characters are more minor, or maybe they just don't have enough content to really make fulfilling analysis segments for them, but I don't really think that applies here. The analyses may have to be a little quicker unless you spend a lot of time focusing on the series as a whole on top of the characters, which is perfectly fine, but even if they are quick analyses, I think that's also fine as long as they are well written. Longer analyses does not mean better episode necessarily. If we can get all killer no filler with this one, then I would definitely be down for that. And Battle Beast being in the Invincible show more and now getting his own comic series, I do also think increases this matchup's chances for happening. Yeah, I could see Mark or Eve getting an episode first, and there are one or two One Punch Man characters I could see them maybe wanting to prioritize, but I could still see them getting to this one eventually. Maybe. I would really hope that they do. And last but not least, Steve versus Terrarian, Minecraft versus Terraria. This has been a very big matchup in this community for quite a long time, and I've said this in a few videos before, Steve is one of those characters that just has a ton of matchups, like a ridiculous amount, some of them good and some of them bad. They're just not all gonna be created equal, you know what I mean? Now, I am not a big Minecraft guy, I've never really been a big Minecraft guy, but I think I can say that this is probably technically my preferred matchup for Steve, or Terrarian for that matter, but I think that pretty well goes without saying. And yes, I understand that a lot of the other opponents for Steve have a lot of supporters from people in different corners of this community, because I think it can really depend on your familiarity or unfamiliarity with different opponents. But out of what I've seen, I just think that the connections and the compatibility in a death battle between these characters just feels the strongest in this matchup. There's a lot of fun things to discuss, even if it's not super close. Kind of harkens back to what I was saying about some one-sided fights being at least interesting to talk about. And these characters definitely fight very differently and use very different tools than what you would normally see on Death Battle. And I still want Death Battle to try new things. We don't know how it's going to turn out if they don't try, right? Now, we also have to look at this from a sheer production perspective, and this would largely be Death Battle mixing 2D and 3D characters and worlds together for this animation. And usually that's not really a big deal for them. They're no stranger to taking 3D characters and using them as 2D sprites, etc. But for this matchup, it may be difficult to try to stay true to both of the games. I remember I talked about this for Paper Mario versus Epic Mickey, where their 2D and 3D aesthetics respectively really influence how they look, how they operate. It might be really tough to combine them and still stay true to both of them at the same time, and I could see that being somewhat true for Steve versus Terrarian as well. Not to say it's impossible, I think if they could make it work, then it could be really great. It's just something they would have to put some extra thought into, something they'd really have to navigate around. Just wanted to bring it up. Now, in terms of the matchup's likelihood, it is a little tough because I think this matchup reaches out to more people in this community specifically, but Steve versus Emmett would reach out to more people just on the internet in general. I know there are a lot of people that know Emmett that wouldn't necessarily know Terrarian as well. I know I definitely know Emmett more than Terrarian, and I would have actually bet on that one happening before because it was on the champion poll, but it seems like Death Battle does actually like this matchup too, since it got a Death Battle cast episode and they were pretty favorable towards it, so it does give me a little more faith for this one happening. But like all things, we'll just have to wait and see. And on that note, we are wrapping it up. Thanks to my subscribers for their contributions to all of this, and thank you for sticking to the end. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't already, and again, read the description of this video for more information about this series. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and peace out.